And so we were talking about Darwin, and he finally published The Origin of Species. He didn't use the word evolution, but he did use the word evolve. So I guess he set the groundwork for using that particular term. But he did use the word descent with modification, and that was, that was the overarching summary of the fact that he saw very similar characteristics in even in animals that he saw that he observed around him in England, and not alone, not irregardless of the fact that he definitely saw them on his travels. And he definitely created this tree image, which we don't really use anymore, but we use more this side image, like the graphic that you see. And then back to, remember Carl Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, with regard to his idea of taxonomy. His Darwin meshed very well with that thought process. And what you have in this particular graphic that's very useful to stop and look at in a little bit more detail. At the very top, you have an animal called the Hyrexus. And it is kind of like a groundhog. That's what it looks like. That's the kind of animal you're thinking of. And that groundhoggy looking animal is actually in the same lineage or in the same pedigree or the family tree of the elephant. And so what happens is, in terms of this descent with modification, you have that, particularly when you look at the snout, highly related to the manatee. And then the fact that the manatee is an early relation, I guess you might say, to what was the early elephant. That's quite a leap, because first of all, the manatee is a sea animal, elephant a land animal. But what was helpful with regard to fossils is then these two steps in between were found with regard to fossilized specimens that not only reiterated the physical characteristics between the manatee and the gopher-looking animal, but also this going from sea to land. And so you have these two fossilized animals, and the reason they're off to the side is because they don't exist anymore. There's just found the fossils. And then also clearly some of these other evolutionary pathways down to the African and the Asian elephant don't exist anymore. But this particular graphic is what it's showing you is how fossils helped fill in the blanks. That he observed that animals, that there were species that didn't seem like they had anything in common, but they did have many things in common. And so this tree of life theory was created by himself, and then that tree of life theory was picked up. We actually have an image of his drawing of the tree of life was picked up, but filled in a different way in more modern thinking. The other thing that happened that was going on clearly in Darwin's time, as in our time, is they had artificial selection. Certainly, one just has to watch one BBC drama, and you can see where in England at that time they were very interested in dogs, and they were very interested in horses, and they were actually interested very much in breeding of both animals. And so they understood how selecting something artificially, and you don't even have to go that direction. I mean, you can go into farming, how selecting things for their qualities, this artificial selection, changes the overall look of whatever you as a human are trying to create. And so this artificial selection was definitely being used, and used to an advantage in terms of, as I said, hunting dogs, or even agriculture, probably a better way to use this. And what you have here is a wild mustard in the middle. The wild mustard is the ancient ancestor for all of these plants which we recognize, like kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, and kohlrabi. It's just that different parts of this wild mustard that they have people who have bred this wild mustard have taken different aspects of it and exaggerated it into these plants. So natural selection was very well known and used at that time. But Darwin came up with two observations, and the observations are important that you have in your head. One is that members of a population often have vary in their inherited traits. So I didn't read that right, but basically, if you look at these ladybugs or lady beetles, and they have a wide variety of color, all within kind of that orangey hue, a wide variety of spots. Many of them have multiple spots, and I even see one there that has no spots, and many of them have a larger or smaller white piece on there. So if in fact these lady beetles need to use their coloring for camouflage, some of them are going to be much better adapted than others. So there's a lot of variety in the overarching inherited traits. So we're not talking about variety that makes the ladybug look not like a ladybug, but just saying you think of the variety of the orange color. And then the second observation is all species produce far more offspring than the environment can support. And that means that some of those offspring are not going to survive. And this is where this concept of survival of the fittest has come in. So far more offspring than the immediate environment can support. And what that does then, in theory, without any outside influence or maybe even luck, you might say, the individuals that have been produced in this reproduction, the most adaptable to that environment are going to be the ones that then can reproduce. And those observations led to these inferences, which those with inherited traits that give them a higher probability for surviving based on the environment then are going to be able to have more offspring. So that is the inference based on the first observation. And we have a nice graphic here where you have the mice. And those mice that are more likely to camouflage themselves are not going to be eaten by the birds. And so what you have, if you go from left to right, you have an equal distribution of tan and gray mice, and then what happens over populations, you have far more gray mice than tan mice that are going to be able to reproduce. So eventually there will be very few tan mice. And then inference 2, this unequal ability of individuals to survive will lead to an accumulation of a specifically favorable trait over generations. So that trait over generations will mean that that particular species is more adapted to its environment. Now please understand that environments are changing at the same time, so as long as the species keeps adapting to the environment, things are good. But if the environment changes dramatically very quickly, then the species is generally in trouble. Darwin was also influenced by an economist called Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was, whose name was Thomas Malthus. He, as an economist, theorized that the potential for human population to increase faster than food supplies and other resources and that in that case, then some people are going to unfortunately not have any resources, so that you actually have, unfortunately, and his idea was, he was talking about poverty, and he was talking about the need to take care of, or what we do with, or the thoughts about people who don't have enough. I assume his theory was that, unfortunately, that is a human condition, that people are going to overpopulate their food resources. But Darwin picked that up and realized that that same thing is true in natural environments, that naturally people populate the environment, and so, or not, species overpopulate the environment, so that some organisms are going to be more successful than others. And then, of course, you have this this idea of inherited traits will basically build on themselves, and that that process works because organisms are matched to their environment, and that this happens over time. And what this graphic is showing us is three different mantid insects. One, and they're all the same species, I mean the same genus, but you have one in Trinidad, one in Malaysia, and one in Costa Rica. Each one is highly adapted to its environment in terms of camouflage. If you took one up, if you took the flower mannatid from Malaysia and put it in Costa Rica, it would be at a huge disadvantage. So what happens is these bugs are camouflaging themselves because they don't want birds to eat them. Birds tend to see patterns. And each of them are so highly adapted to their environment that they have actually blended in with their environment. This happens over time. This isn't something that this particular species, there is a common ancestor between all three of them, but over time, in the area that they've lived in, they've created this camouflage. And then if the environment changes over time, natural selection then will start over again. That results in adaptations to these new conditions and give rise to new species then. There are several overarching thoughts that support Darwin's descent with modification. And there you have it at the top of this slide. Just wanted to make sure that individuals don't evolve, populations do over time. So natural selection can only increase or decrease traits. So natural selection, as we said before, is a pattern. Natural selection, you could say, maybe is the cause of evolution, and adaptions are the reason there is natural selection, or the terms are very interchangeable, I guess I might say, or dependent on one another maybe. The discoveries that are more modern fill in the gaps with regard to Darwin's Origin of Species. Two examples, and actually we have a couple more that help. We have this this concept of drug-resistant bacteria, which is very much of a problem now. But you have a nice picture here where you have a population of bacteria. The yellow ones are most abundant. You only have two red ones in the image furthest to the left, and then antibiotics come along and kill off most of the yellow ones. And then what you have are the red ones that are are resistant, are able to multiply. So you have, in a very short period of time, remember bacteria can create generations over hours, but in a very short period of time, in terms of our concept of time, you have a whole population that then has evolved and is resistant to bacteria. And then another scientific example that fleshed out Darwin's ideas is the soapberry bug, and we'll pick this up on the next one.